warm side up here on the platform. You don't mind if I take my coat off, do you? Cool off just a little bit here, I think. There, that's better. Can you see him? He's on his journey back. There he travels, dusty roads and sometimes bandit-infested passes that he must go over. There he finds himself setting sail aboard a ship that he's paid for to get him across to return home. Back in those days, there was no air flight and no fast travel, primitive travel, and yet he carried with him something that was priceless. And I'm here this morning with you, and for 2,000 years, believers like you and like me have benefited from his journey. And often he's overlooked. And there's a good chance that not only the letter of Paul to the Philippians, but possibly the letters of Ephesians and Colossians and the letter of Philemon were carried by him safely and were protected by him through what could well have been a perilous journey, where on foot, for the most part, he traveled some 600 to 800 miles to deliver those letters. You've heard me say from this pulpit that there are people, just like I know you have in Scripture, that I'm looking forward to meeting. And I know when we talk about heaven, of course, we talk about looking forward to seeing loved ones that have gone on before us, people we've known personally. We look forward to seeing grandma again, or grandpa, or someone who we grew to love and care about, and we're looking forward to seeing them. But there's also a whole lot of other people we're going to enjoy seeing. And when I get to heaven, at some point, I want to look him up and corner Epaphroditus and say, brother, thank you. Thank you for the benefit that came to me in my Christian life from the letter of Philippians, because you carried it from that prison, from that incarceration of Paul. You carried that letter back to the Philippians, and God protected it for 2,000 years, over 2,000, so that I could benefit and be enriched by it. Epaphroditus, he's only mentioned in just a place or two in Philippians. We know very little about him. We don't know, for instance, that he was some great preacher or communicator or evangelist. We don't know that he had the kind of notoriety that Timothy would have had, who we looked at last week. But he was valuable, and valuable to the Apostle Paul. And I want you to forgive me for this little sidetrack for a moment, but when somebody goes out of their way to serve you and support you, it's something that you never forget. And I don't do this very often, and I have to be kind of careful when I do it from the pulpit, but I sometimes, withholding appreciation is not right either. And though I am grateful for all of God's people, and I can look around this room and everybody here has shown some kindness to Kathy or to me, but did you know that from our arrival here 31 years ago, that fall, Lauren Gunther came to my home and he said, I hope you've got some boots and gloves because we need to get your wood in. And listen to me now, for 20 years in a row, Lauren used his own truck, his own saws, his own gas, his own oil. He picked me up and we made several trips to the woods and cut and split all my winter's wood supply for 20 years in a row. Now, sometimes we might go out of our way for somebody for a couple hours, but that's the kind of faithful friend and brother and support I have benefited from, and my whole family benefited from our dear brother Lauren. And I'm so grateful, Lauren. And I hope you know I'll never forget it. And we still go up and bump around in the woods once in a while and work up a sweat and poke fun at each other. But I'm grateful, Lauren, and I always will be. You kept my family warm for 2 decades. Did you know that? All on his own dime. More than a dime. But I'm just so very thankful. Well, Paul was thankful for this man, Epaphroditus. And that's who we're looking at today. And I've entitled the message, The Adventure of a Yielded Life. What we learn about Epaphroditus is that he traveled nearly 800 miles from the believers in Philippi all the way to the Apostle Paul, where he was incarcerated in Rome. And he went there to serve him, to minister to him, to take financial support from the church in Philippi all the way to Rome, hand-carrying it in dangerous circumstances. And we're going to learn about him. And the amazing thing is just the idea that this letter that's going to be carried back to the Philippians and eventually to Kettle Falls was being carried by this man Epaphroditus that Paul is writing about in this text. So first let's look at the text itself. We're looking at verses 25 through 30 of Philippians chapter 2. You can follow along as I read. Paul writes these words, "But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus." And if you just skip the rest of the verse and go to verse 26, it says, "Because he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick." That's really the flow of this passage. But Paul couldn't resist expressing his heart's appreciation. So back up to verse 25 again. "But I thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger and minister to my need. Because he was longing for you all and was distressed because you had heard that he was sick. For indeed he was sick to the point of death, but God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, so that I would not have sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I have sent him all the more eagerly, so that when you see him again, you may rejoice, and I may be less concerned about you. Receive him. Receive him then in the Lord with all joy, and hold men like him in high regard, because he came close to death for the work of Christ, risking his own life to complete what was deficient in your service to me." In these verses, in a general sense, Paul is doing 3 things. He's expressing his affirmation, which we find in verse 25. He's expressing his affection for Epaphroditus, which you can imagine. It wasn't like Paul was living in ideal circumstances, and he had this wonderful brother who was willing to travel 600 or 800 miles just to come and support him and encourage him and give him what he needed and so on. I mean, he went out of his way. I mean, if you were broke down and I was willing to walk from here to Chihuahua, you'd be talking about that for years. This man traveled 600 to 800 miles for Paul. His affirmation in verse 25, his affection in verses 26 through 28, and then his appreciation at the end of this section where he says, receive him then in the Lord with all joy and hold men like him in high regard. Why? Well, because he modeled Christ and the sacrificial love and willingness to serve that Paul mentions earlier in this chapter when he says, have this mind in yourselves, which was in Christ Jesus. And so we know Epaphroditus traveled 800 miles to Paul to minister to his needs. But we're told earlier in the chapter that he that was in the very form of God did not regard equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, not 600 or 800 miles, but from the glory of heaven with his Father all the way to the virgin's womb. And we know the rest of the story, that he gave and gave and gave the ultimate at the cross to save us, to redeem us, to pay the penalty of our sins. Aren't you thankful for the Savior? And Epaphroditus, in some small way, is a reflection of that same one who now lives in Epaphroditus. But if you notice there in verse 25, Paul kind of has a parenthesis. I'm sending him to you because he's longing for you and because you heard he was sick. But let me tell you what I think about him, how I describe him. And so Paul describes him in 5 ways. He's my brother, my fellow worker, my fellow soldier. He's also your messenger and servant or minister to my needs. It struck me when I was thinking about it in its context, how that Paul mentions him as a brother. And if you look back in chapter 1, verse 5, he speaks of the fellowship of the gospel. So Epaphroditus was a brother in the fellowship of the gospel, just like we are here. He was a fellow worker for the furtherance of the gospel, which he mentions in verse 12. And he was also a fellow soldier, which was in the faith, or to defend the faith of the gospel. Verse 27 of chapter 1. And then he mentions how he is that to me, but from you, he's your messenger to me and your minister. And what had happened was he had come that long journey to Paul, but he had fallen sick. Sick to the point of dying, as he risked his own life to get the money, to get the help and the support to Paul that they had sent him with. What a dear brother. Don't you want to meet him someday and say, hey, thanks for getting that letter of Philippians back to them, or I would have never had it, right? I want to thank him someday. Well, when we think about his life, I was just pondering Epaphroditus, thinking about what that must have been like. Wouldn't you have liked to have been a fly on the wall and listened to him as Paul said, tell me about your trip. How'd it go? And you could hear the ups and downs, the close calls, situations where maybe somebody coming up the road warned him of a certain area where there were some bandits that he had to watch out for. All the kind of things that went on back at that time. And just the stories that they would have shared back and forth. And of course, Paul's interest in how the church at Philippi was doing. How's Lydia doing? And her family that I led to Christ there on that riverbank. And what's going on with the Philippian jailers? He's still serving Rome that way? And his family, they all responded to the gospel. How are they all doing? And on and on. How's the church doing? How's it growing? And the interaction between these two that share this bond in the gospel. But as I thought about it, I thought, what is it about this man and about all who live their lives by the way of the cross? If anyone will come after me, Jesus said, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot of different things to different people. Now, I don't necessarily think that if I have a flu bug, that's the cross. If I have high blood pressure, that's the cross. Or if I have a toothache, that's the cross. The cross always has something to do with a yielded life, yielding our lives to do the Lord's purposes, to do His will, and to be His representative in this fallen world. And for each of us, it comes in many different forms. But as I thought about this, I thought, well, what is it? What's in the secret sauce? What is it that makes for this adventure of a yielded life? When you come to a sign and it's a triangle and it's yellow and it says yield, what do? Accelerate. No. Why? Well, because there's something you're being called upon to restrict something. You're being called upon to deny something. You're being called upon to be careful, etc., etc. But this is a yielded life, a life yielded to Christ. Now, and I realize I'm taking some liberty because I'm just using my imagination about Epaphroditus and what a life of yieldedness means for you and me. The adventure of walking by faith and the adventure of serving Christ. And I came across this, and I want to share it with you for a moment to illustrate. During the period of Nazi Germany, there was a man named Dietrich who lived in Germany. He was well educated, he was scholarly, he was a pastor and an author, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Ultimately, Dietrich was martyred by the Germans and was hung. But Dietrich, though he was a pastor, and an evangelical pastor, if you will, who believed the gospel and wanted to see people won to Christ, he was also part of the resistance and was actually part of some of the plots to assassinate Hitler. And the Third Reich and the Gestapo had done investigations, had persecuted some of his family. Ultimately, they caught him and incarcerated him. And the story of his life is from one concentration camp to another, one imprisonment to another. And he writes in his journals about his relationships with the other prisoners. Because in his mind, just like Paul, he looked at it all and said, is this the end, or is this designed for the furtherance of the gospel? What would God do with me? If I only have weeks to live, what will He do with me? And actually, for several years, he went through this. And he writes all about these stories, but something came home to his heart, and I want to share it with you because it's really got a hold of me. It's a way of thinking about the way of the cross. And in reflecting on this life, take up your cross and follow me. Dietrich began to have this mental vision, this mental picture, I guess, to apply that teaching in his surroundings, with other prisoners and others that were political prisoners. He did it this way. He said, as I begin each new day, I have a path. And of course, I make plans. I have hopes for what the day. I hope there'll be time for some reading. They did let him have a Bible. Maybe some writing. There's some things I'd like to do. But as I plan my day in hopes we'll get fed today, hopes that the food we eat will not be rancid and that it'll stay down. All the things that accompanied his hardships, he said, I picture that path this way, but Lord, I want to live a yielded life to you so that if you bring someone across my path, I want to see it. I want to recognize that you want me to be yielded to you and be willing to pause and recognize that this is not an accident. You put this person in my path so that I can speak a word for you, or pray with that prisoner, or give them hope, or share my crumbs of bread with them, or whatever the need may be. And he lived for several years on a daily basis with that mindset that as I pursue my life, God, you're going to bring people across my path, and I can't be so focused on my own plans that I don't allow you to interrupt them. Otherwise, I'm not living a yielded life. And there's no adventure. It's just me, one footstep in front of the other, doing my own thing and trying to accomplish only my goals. There's no adventure in that. God, what do you have for me today? And Dietrich gave himself to the Lord in that way and led many prisoners to Christ and turned many back to the Lord and gave men hope who were looking at the gallows or execution. And he spent several years pouring himself out as one who understood the adventure of the yielded life. And I got to tell you guys, this is so simple. I'm hoping it's getting through to you, but just picture your life every day as this path you're on. And whenever God brings somebody across that path, pause. Say, Lord, is this the way of the cross? It forms a cross. In his mind's eye, he saw that person crossing, and there they were. And if I'm to yield and deny myself and take up my cross, then this person is right there at the center of the crossbeam, and I'm to give of myself in some way to minister to them. Isn't that great? It just really shook me when I pondered that, because it was so simple for such a brilliant scholar, which Dietrich Bonhoeffer was, to think in such simplicity and devotion to Christ. Well, what is it that Dietrich understood? What is it that's in the secret sauce? Well, the secret sauce is basically this. We all live our lives like everybody else does. We have plans, we have purposes, we have hopes, we have objectives, we have schedules, things we'd like to accomplish. And sometimes when we're on the job, we have to accomplish them. We can't stop to minister to everybody, or our boss will say, I didn't hire you to do that. I'm going to fire you. So there's wisdom, there's discernment. You can pause long enough to say, hey, how about after work we meet? I'll buy you a cup of coffee. Instead of just ignoring the person, pick a different time. There's all kinds of scenarios. But what is it that we understand? Well, it's this, that our God, who is in control of your life and mine, he is sovereign over it all, which means he's sovereign over the little details of daily life. And he brings people across our path. Some people call it a divine appointment. I like that language. That makes sense to me. But I like Dietrich's vision of that cross when somebody crosses my path. Well, listen to a few verses. These are just by way of reminder. I know that you know these, but we need reminded now and then. Proverbs 16, verse 9 says, the mind of man plans his way. And when the proverb says that, it isn't saying there's anything wrong with that. In fact, it's commendable to have a plan. It's commendable. In fact, my wife is the one who basically organizes our lives, because I'm not that much that way, but she makes lists and priorities and keeps me in line, and I appreciate it. I wince at it once in a while, but it's actually quite good for me. The mind of man plans his way, but the Lord directs his steps. See that? There's nothing wrong with my mind planning my way, as long as my steps are available to him. That's a yielded life. Proverbs 19:21 puts it this way: many plans are in the heart of a man, but the counsel of the Lord will stand. His counsel, his designs, his purpose overrides the planning of my heart at times. Have you ever found that to be true? Of course. Proverbs 27 verse 1 says, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring forth." And what that really means is you don't know what God's going to bring forth. Because a day doesn't bring anything forth. A day isn't alive with wisdom and power and sovereignty. So that's metaphoric language for God is in control of our days. In Acts chapter 18, the apostle, speaking of the apostle Paul, Luke writes, "They came to Ephesus and he left them there. Now he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews, and when they asked him to stay for a longer time, he did not consent. But taking leave of them, he said to them, 'I will return to you again, if God wills.'" There's the secret sauce. The yieldedness, the reliance upon a God who wills in all our lives, a God who purposes in all our lives. The invisible hand of God that leads us. In Romans chapter 1, verse 10, Paul says, "I'm always in my prayers making request, if perhaps now at last, by the will of God, I may succeed in coming to you." By the will of God, I may succeed. See that? Now I know this is basic, but sometimes we need to bring it back to the forefront and realize the Lord is in control of my days. Romans 4:19 says, "But I will come to you soon," Paul writes, "if the Lord wills." 1 Corinthians 16:7 says, "For I do not wish to see you now just in passing. For I hope to remain with you for some time, if the Lord permits." If the Lord permits. And I suppose the verses that we probably are most familiar with on this topic are found in James chapter 4, verse 13 through 16. James writes, "Come now, you who say, 'Today or tomorrow we will go to such and such a city and spend a year there and engage in business and make a profit. Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears for a little while and then vanishes away.' Instead," here's the secret sauce, "instead you ought to say, 'If the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that.' But as it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil." So the Bible commends planning. It commends we live an orderly life. It commends us for having a schedule, having goals, achieving things. But discipleship in this call of Jesus, "If anyone will come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." Right? And if you lose your life for my sake, Jesus said, and for the gospel, you're blessed. Why? Because it turns your whole life into adventure. The adventure of a yielded life. And if nothing else from this message, I hope that you would just take that mental picture of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who decided, "I'm going to make the most of this experience under Nazi Germany's reign. And out of this unpleasant circumstance and the difficulties that I face, Lord, you said, deny myself and take up my cross. What will that look like for me on a daily basis?" And he said, "This is what I'm going to do. Every time somebody crosses my path, we're married in 1982. In June 19th, we will have been married 40 years together. 40 years. Wow, Kath. How'd we get from there to here? 6 grandkids, and all of you. It's an adventure of faith, yieldedness. Lord, what would you have me do? So someday, when you bump into Epaphroditus, which for me won't be very long, I'll see him soon enough along with many, many others. But I want to pause and say, hey, brother, fellow worker, fellow soldier, thank you for protecting, guarding, and safely delivering the letter of Philippians, and maybe Ephesians, maybe Colossians, for delivering those prison epistles, because thousands of years of believers benefited from that journey. You think when he was carrying that, he had any notion of a little group gathered in Kettle Falls on the other side of the world a couple thousand years later? Do you think he had any notion the value of what he was carrying? I don't think he did. But I'm going to tell him when I see him. Aren't you? All right. Well, that finishes our time in the Word this morning. What should we sing, Kath? Let's all stand together. How about the little chorus, make me like you, please make me like you, you are a servant, make me one too. Oh Lord, I am willing, do what you must do to make me like you, Lord. Just make me like you. Remember that one? Can you lead us, Kath?
Please
make me like you, please make